My name is Dr. Alayna, and I'm going to be talking to you today about DE&I programs and how they don't work, or maybe they do work, maybe they sometimes work. It is a clickbait title, I know. But we're going to basically go through some of the work I've done in this field and what I've learned along the way, and also some of the research I'm now doing. Now that I'm kind of not directly working in the industry, I'm able to kind of do a bit of a broader analysis into this field, which I've been kind of craving doing for a while. So we're going to go through a bit of that. I'll tell you a little more about myself in a minute, but first I really want to talk about what we're doing here. So my hypothesis, the thing that's on the door, is that DE&I programs don't work. This is what we're going to try and unpick today. Before we dig into that, we need to try to understand what that actually means. So let's start with a definition of DE&I. Equity, diversity, and inclusion is a conceptual framework that promotes the fair treatment and full participation of all people, especially populations that have historically been underrepresented or subject to discrimination. There's an American Psychological Association definition. I like it because it talks about participation. It's not just about inclusion. It's not just about not being treated badly. It's about feeling like you can fully participate in every way in the things that you are being asked to do in your workplace. It's feeling like you can participate in the same way that others can. And so this is, when we're talking about DE&I, at least in my opinion, the sorts of things we're talking about. I think that it's worth noting that a lot of people have different opinions of what DE&I is, and different people you ask will answer it in different ways. Some of them will be positive, some of them will be negative, and a lot of them are pretty valid. We have a lot of baggage in this field. We have a lot of history where DE&I has meant different things for different people because of the different frameworks and programs and things that have been implemented. And so one of the things I want to challenge you to do as we kind of go through this talk together today is when people say DE&I programs don't work or they're bad, to start to kind of hear that with an amount of generosity, an amount that the person deserves, depending on, if it's a good faith kind of a comment, because some DE&I programs don't work, and that isn't necessarily false. That is, about the experience of these programs that some people have. So, DE&I. What is a DE&I program? Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are systematic organisational interventions that aim to increase the participation of underrepresented groups while fostering equitable and inclusive environments across leadership, operations, and culture. So the key there is systematic organisational interventions. For something to be a DE&I program, it's not something that an individual is doing. It is something that an organisation is doing. It is something systematic, involved as an intervention that's meant to change an organisation fundamentally. That can be something an individual leads, but there is a certain amount of organisational support that is needed for an organisation to change and for that to be kind of an intervention that impacts everybody within an organisation to some extent. There's going to be quite a bit of academic stuff in here. I think there's like 7 slides worth of references, but it's being said by cute little pastel birds, so that you can forgive me for how much research there is in the back. All right. And the last thing we need to understand, if we're going to talk about how DE&I programs work or don't, is what does working mean? And so I suggest that an effective DE&I program is one that achieves its goal. So what's the goal? And we looked at this definition already about what DE&I is, and we talked about participation. Is that the goal? Is it about making equitable and inclusive environments? Is it about making changes across leadership, operations, and culture? Is it about this kind of systematic organisational intervention thing that we were just talking about? What's the goal? And I'm not necessarily saying this is the goal. I'm saying this is what one person says the goal should be. But we need to talk about that if we're going to understand what this means. Many DE&I programs fail to achieve those goals we just listed, that someone has said should be the goals of these programs. But the question is, are they trying to? And if they're not trying to, are they failing? They're not meeting those goals, but they don't want to. Cool. So, with all of that out of the way, this is me. I am the goblin. I have worked in DE&I in the games industry now for over a decade. I started off working as a DE&I consultant in a not-for-profit capacity while I was doing my PhD. I then worked in the industry as a producer for a time, went into being a DE&I manager full-time at Sledgehammer Games, which is a AAA company that works on Call of Duty primarily. I have experience, again, working as a director and consultant in a DE&I firm called Beacon and Briar. I've written a number of books over the years about games, representation, and DE&I as well. And I now work again as a game studies lecturer and researcher. And I have my doctorate in creative arts. I looked at queer representation in traditional literature. So I've been thinking about this stuff for a really long time. And when I first got into that intersection between DE&I and games, it was because I was doing DE&I study in an academic kind of capacity, but in a non-games field where it was being talked about quite a bit. And then I was teaching students in games and realizing that this conversation about kind of queerness in games and even accessibility and representation of culture and gender, all of these things kind of weren't being talked about much yet, especially queerness in games. Like that was kind of my primary research area. We have a bit more of it now. We have a bit more of that discussion, which is amazing to see. But, you know, we're talking a little more than 10 years ago, it was really, really empty in that field. And so I started working in this area because I saw a gap, and I saw that it was something that I could kind of fill because I started to have that games knowledge from my work and then that DE&I knowledge from my research, and I kind of started to bring them together, and I love it. And so I've been doing it ever since. It's been really interesting seeing the sort of bell curve, I guess, of interest in this space where we've had people build up and start to notice and care and really take take some steps into this area. And then as certain administrations and political movements have changed, how that has kind of ebbed away a little bit, and maybe being visibly invested in this work kind of comes with more of a price now than it had done for a little while, where it was actually kind of a boon and it was a benefit. So yeah, I've been around for a while, and that's the context to which I bring to this talk. All right, so let's get back into the goals of DE&I programs. Here's a bunch of text. This is what a bunch of people have said those goals might be. And I don't necessarily agree or disagree with any of them, but I do think it's interesting to see how many different academics and researchers and industry people have kind of listed such different goals about what a DE&I program should do. We have ensuring equitable experiences for all employees, creating psychologically safe and inclusive workplaces, increasing meaningful participation of marginalised groups, there's that word again, and that's from a different researcher, driving long-term organisational culture change, so looking at that full kind of organisation aspect again instead of individual change. Attracting, retaining and advancing diverse talent, so is it about the people we're hiring? Is that what we mean? Meeting legal obligations and public expectations. That one's kind of saying the quiet part out loud, but the rest of this talk will kind of dig into what kind of that is also a valid goal of these programs. That's something that companies are trying to do with them. Reducing legal and reputational risk with proactive measures. Signalling values to shareholders and audiences. Again, the quiet part out loud, but it is sometimes what these companies are doing, especially at times when it becomes clear that shareholders want to see that this is happening. Expanding market reach through alignment with consumers, so basically meaning that more people will purchase your things because they know that your company and their values align with the values of the person buying the game. And enhancing creativity and innovation via team diversity is also a potential goal of these programs. All of these are true. Certain people will feel that this is the goal of the program. All of these things can be impacted by diversity, but not every company will care about all of these things in equal measure. Not every individual will care about all of these things. So it's about kind of understanding that DE&I programs can have a gazillion different goals, and every individual DE&I program therefore needs to be built in a way that achieves the goals that it's trying to achieve, as opposed to it being built based on what we think a good DE&I program is, or what we think everyone else has done before and therefore what we should do too. Because if your goals don't align with the person who made that other program, copying their program isn't really going to help you because you're trying to achieve something else. And so it becomes kind of unfair if you take that program model, apply it to a different context, and then it achieves those goals and not your goals. And then you're like, it's not working. It's like, well, yeah, of course it's not working. It's not doing the thing that you want it to do because you didn't design it to do that. And so we start to see a bit of a discrepancy in terms of what different people within organisations maybe want programs to do. And this is quite general. Like when I say executives, I mean like the faceless beast at the top of an organisation, A lot of individuals who are in more executive roles really kind of line up with the employees want column, but it can be really, really difficult to drive for organizational change within these big capitalist bureaucratic kind of systems. And it can even be difficult within an independent kind of indie system, right? You've got all these different things that you're trying to prioritize, and when you're in a position of executive power and you are kind of a director trying to juggle all of those priorities, this is often not priority one. And that, I think, is something we all kind of understand, but it can be difficult when you're going into it with a sense of like real like moral righteousness that like we need to do this and this is important, to have the conversation in a pragmatic way that accounts for that. Like, we need to find ways to talk about DE&I and talk about inclusive outcomes without dismissing the fact that there are other priorities, other needs, other things that we now, sometimes need to be paying attention to. So employees may want the equitable experiences, the psychological safety, they want to feel like they can meaningfully participate, they want long-term change within their organisations, they don't want, flash in the pan initiatives, they want to see things changing, and they really want opportunities for career advancement. And all of this is not something just that marginalised people within companies want. This is stuff everyone wants. They want to feel like it's an equitable place for them to work, that they have opportunities for advancement, they have a future within the company, they want to feel like they are safe to say what they think and that there's not going to be massive consequences and repercussions for being themselves at work. And so if we think about DE&I in ways that it can serve the needs of every single person in an organisation, like, these are goals that every single person has. And so how do we create programs that we can say, oh, this isn't just for, the women, it's not just for the people of colour, this is for everyone. How do we create psychological safety for everyone? And it then has a lot of benefits for the marginalised people within the organisation as well. But how do we rise all of the boats? Because it's an easier sell in a lot of ways within organisations when you can show that it has kind of collective benefit. And then you've got executives wanting talent attraction and retention in some cases, legal compliance. It would be weird if executives didn't want legal compliance in some respects. They want to reduce risk, because of course. They want to show people what their values are, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is ways of companies being able to show their audiences, hey, this is what we believe in. There's just maybe good and bad ways of doing that, and more performative ways or more sincere ways of doing that, but the actual signalling of value is not a bad thing inherently. They want to expand their audience into other markets usually, and they want to innovate and do things that are kind of creative. Again, this is kind of what, in general, executives may be looking for. And so there's not necessarily a conflict between these two things. Programs can achieve both of these lists simultaneously, but there is a discrepancy, right, between what executives might intend and what employees intend as the most, high priority aspect of these programs. But I want to kind of point out that executives and kind of director boards and these C-suites of people focusing on compliance and optics isn't new. This is literally what DE&I programs, or what they used to be called diversity programs or civil rights programs, were built for. So DE&I programs started as a response to affirmative action programs in the United States following civil rights legislation. So the very first programs that sort of resemble what we do now were made deliberately to make sure that these new laws and new rules that were coming in were being followed by employers. And so employers would bring in some sort of DE&I specialist who would know this law very well, know these changes really well, and could make sure that internal policies within the organisation were doing everything that they needed to do so that they wouldn't get sued. So through the 60s, these diversity departments literally just were built for that purpose. It wasn't until the 80s that they started to expand into more proactive measures. Those proactive measures were generally things like some basic training of some sort, and that came in response to some high-profile lawsuits that occurred. Even though we had these internal programs kind of trying to make sure compliance was happening, companies started to realise they needed to sort of signal that externally and show, actually, look, we're doing something with our team, we're making sure that this is happening. And so they were trying to signal compliance and also just reduce the risk of reputational damage. They were, trying to reduce the loss of resources because they, were being put into lawsuits where they were either having to settle or they were, wasting time in these things. And so the first thing that kind of came as part of this proactive movement was mandatory sensitivity training. And so if you've heard of sensitivity training, this is why it's one of the most associated terms with DE&I, because it's one of the first programs that got used as a DE&I program. So firms often adopted highly visible but low impact diversity actions, so things like posters, newsletters, events within the workplace, because they provided symbolic reassurance to stakeholders without disrupting internal hierarchies. So the goal in the 80s wasn't actual meaningful change in these organizations. It wasn't inclusion necessarily. It was for some, but this is kind of the generalization in terms of what companies were collectively trying to do. And it was about symbolically reassuring people, we care about this stuff, don't worry about it, please don't sue us. And so if we look at these programs from the 60s through to the 80s, this isn't the skeleton or the foundation that I would want to build a DE&I program on. If we want to meet contemporary goals of inclusion and support and actually looking after our marginalised team members, this is not the skeleton that I would be aiming to kind of build upon. We get into the 90s and the 2000s. And so this is the time when some key research started to come out about what diversity could do for teams. And it was very much framed as a strategic advantage that you could have as a corporation if you leaned into diversity outcomes. There were all these really cool meta-analyses that started to come out, and you can look them up, where they basically pulled together heaps of existing research and gave kind of some trends and outcomes as a result of that. And they showed that diverse cultural perspectives in workplaces could increase innovation and improve profits. And so some companies started to think, maybe there's more to this than just trying to prevent damage. Maybe we could be gaining something from this, and maybe that thing we could be gaining is money. And so there was this kind of feeling of, okay, let's actually lean into this a little bit, let's explore this a little bit. This research is kind of starting to show us this is worth investigating. And so the framing of DE&I started to pivot from complying with requirements to making more money. But the motivations still weren't aligned with social justice. We're still not looking, even in the 2000s, at these programs that maybe we are hoping exist now, or at least I'm hoping would exist now, where we're actually trying to help people and aim for social justice. This isn't what was being kind of aimed for yet in most cases. So it wasn't until the 2010s and 2020s where inclusion and social justice movements actually increased bottom-up pressure for meaningful DE&I programs in organizations, things that were actually making some sort of difference. And so we had this really visible period of social justice movements, like the Me Too movement. We had Stop Asian Hate during COVID due to hate crimes that were occurring then. We had a real resurgence of Black Lives Matter in a big kind of visible online way following the murder of George Floyd. And there were some pretty visible trans inclusion movements that started from about 2015. And so there were a few kind of hotspots of that as we went along as well. And so during this period, that visibility and understanding of social justice started to spread a little bit more. We started to kind of care about that a little more on a population scale. And DE&I programs started to proliferate. This says specifically after George Floyd's murder, but also after several of these kind of moments. But many of these DE&I programs were reactive, and they lacked sustained investment, accountability, or transformation. And so we started to see employees noticing this, caring about this, putting pressure from the bottom up on their bosses and their managers and directors to do something about it. And to kind of quell that pressure, a lot of companies went, okay, yeah, we'll do something about it. And they did. But they weren't necessarily investing in the future of this. They weren't thinking, how do we make something that's sustainable for decades to come? They were potentially thinking okay, how do I do something that's just enough that they'll stop talking about it? And there were a lot of companies that kind of became quite visible in their DE&I work during this time. But if you look now, it's obviously a little bit more risky to be doing DE&I work, and the number of people who are still willing to talk about it is therefore significantly smaller, because there isn't kind of social or kind of financial benefit to doing so anymore, and that makes it significantly less appealing for companies to talk about. And so the question of, do DE&I programs achieve their goals, right? We come back here. If DE&I goals are ensure companies comply with legal requirements and provide positive images to shareholders and audiences, which is what the goals kind of were to start with, then yeah, a lot of DE&I programs totally are doing what they intended to do. So maybe DE&I programs do work. When governments are more progressive, or there are social events and things that are occurring that cause this pressure to take place, mandates include more social justice targets. You start to see metrics about the number of people that are being hired, and we start to see kind of, do you have a DE&I program? You need to have that, and there's pressure that starts to occur. But conversely, when an administration is more conservative, mandates are rolled back, DE&I initiatives are scaled down, and we're seeing that now with the current Trump administration and the influence that the US political system has on other English-speaking countries. Literally the day that Trump was elected, there was executive orders that started to come out about DE&I programs that are illegal, which is such an interesting terminology. And those executive orders are fascinating to read. If you can stomach doing it, feel free to have a little peruse, because they're all online. It's just so interesting seeing what was being said and the impact that it has spread to outside of the US. We often kind of follow. We're talking about George Floyd's murders. George Floyd's murder happened in the US, and now this is happening in the US, and it kind of has this trickle-on effect. But everything that we're seeing right now is the system working as it was designed. We're seeing the kind of ebb and flow in response to progressive and more conservative administrations. We're seeing investment in these programs changing based on whether or not it is kind of beneficial publicly to be invested in these things. It's a system working as it was made to work. It doesn't mean I like it, but it is interesting, I think, to contextualize that the system was built not to do necessarily what we want it to do, as I want it to do, as someone who works in this field and really cares about the social justice aspects of it. The system that I'm working within wasn't designed to help me necessarily with that process. And so how do I kind of burn that down and figure out how to make something that will work, that will be sustainable? And that's a lot of what my research is dedicated to. So the problem is that most DE&I programs were never built to serve the function that critics now expect of them. And so if people say DE&I programs don't work, that's why we don't do them, that kind of criticism is directed at a program that wasn't designed to do the thing they're criticizing it for. The problem is not that DE&I failed, it's that most organizations never built a version that could succeed. And so now we're seeing a failure of that, and some people are surprised by it. So if we want DE&I programs that make genuine organizational change, if that's the goal, we need to start over. We need to burn it all down and start again and figure out how to make programs that actually do make the meaningful change that we want to make. 4 steps to that. Step 1, what are our goals? What do we actually want to achieve? And I gave you heaps of examples of what those goals could be at the beginning of this. But the goals of every individual company, the goals of every individual person will be a little bit different. So step 1 is figuring out what the goals are. And if you're in a position of leadership and power where you can kind of influence DE&I outcomes within a company, what's the team's goals? What do people want to see? Step 2 is, what does the research say will bring us closer to those goals? And I'm actually going to show you some of that as we go through the last part of this talk. How do we test if our initiatives are helping us achieve our goals? So don't just do a thing and be like, look, we did it, yay. But how do we make sure that those things that we are implementing and changing, we are then testing to see if it's working, if our hypothesis is actually following through? I've tried a lot of weird and kind of experimental things over the years because I'm trying to kind of do this burn it all down and start again approach to DE&I programs. And, I was very lucky when I was at Sledgehammer that I got a lot of kind of freedom to do that and see how things worked. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And you kind of need to put yourself in a position where hopefully you have enough trust where when something doesn't quite work out, you can be like, well, that innovative thing we were trying to do didn't quite work, but here's some, surveys we did with the team about what did and didn't work, and this is what we're going to do next, and this is how we're going to kind of iterate on the program. It's very similar to game development in a lot of ways, right? Like you are iterating, you're prototyping, you're trying things out, you're doing pilot groups, you're figuring out, you're playtesting, you're getting feedback. It is very much that sort of loop, that same sort of cycle. And then step 4 is, how can we modify our approach to better align with our goals? So you go through that process, you do that testing, you modify your approach, and you start over. And so our contemporary expectation of DE&I programs is to restructure systemic inequalities, foster safety, support underrepresented staff, and enable true inclusion. Here is a goal that I have found and kind of paraphrased from some academics. So if you're looking for one, you're not quite sure what you want, I like this one, but you're going to need to figure out kind of what your team needs or what you need as a more individual approach as well. But new goals then mean that we need a new approach. We need to try to reach that goal in a new way. We can't just rely on existing approaches. So current diversity training methods are ineffective because they're designed for compliance, like we've been talking about. They're not designed for long-term structural change. So why do we keep using diversity training that doesn't work? Well, diversity training is the most popular tool in the toolbox because it is easy to roll out, it appears proactive, and it can shield firms from liability. Very clear and straight to the point source there. Unconscious bias and sensitivity training are a flagship offering of many DE&I programs, despite limited evidence of their efficacy. And that is because of what we talked about at the beginning, where in the 80s, sensitivity training was the first thing people started using. And so it's the skeleton that a lot of current programs are being built upon. People will often implement a sensitivity training program without thinking a single time, is this effective? Is this going to work? Is this going to achieve the thing we want it to achieve? It's like, no, that's just what you do. And so even though there is ample research on a lot of this stuff by now, that sensitivity training, a one-off day of training, like just doesn't do anything, people keep doing it because it's what you do. And lastly, most DE&I training will seek immediate feedback from participants, but doesn't check to see if things work longitudinally. Doesn't see if the benefits, behavioural changes happen over time, doesn't check back in with people, doesn't do ongoing training. They'll do like an annual sensitivity training where you can kind of skip to the quiz and then you know what the answers are, because it's like, this black person talks to you at work, what do you do? And the answers are like, say hi or say something racist. And then you go, yeah, 100%. Like that doesn't work, funnily enough, because people, even racists, know how to answer that question. And so how do we create things that are actually going to have long-term meaningful change? Here are some of the answers. Interactive embedded strategies like mentorship are more effective than passive bias training. This is proven in the literature. Long-term integrated training programs, including leadership training for everyone, not just for marginalised people, but for everyone, so all leaders know how to treat their teams equitably and well. Mentorship and coaching are some of the only DE&I strategies associated with consistent positive outcomes. Long-term integrated training programs are some of the only DE&I strategies associated with consistent positive outcomes. This is your golden goose. If you're trying to figure out what's the one thing that we can introduce into our company that will help with DE&I outcomes, this is the one. There are a lot of other things that can also have, also work and that also have positive kind of associations, and that meta-analysis have shown kind of work to some extent in certain contexts, etc. This works all the time if it's done well and it's implemented well and it's maintained and it's consistent. Actually pairing people with others, getting them to experience what it's like to work with someone who is from an underrepresented background, making sure all your managers have regular training and know how to be a good manager to anyone who comes onto their team, knowing that like giving marginalised people the investment in them that shows, yep, we want you to keep working here, and this is what the future of working here might look like, and this is what it means to be a leader, and 3 years from now we want you to use those skills with us. Those things about like actual one-on-one connection, long-term integrated training, that's what works. Other things that also work. Embedding DE&I cross-departmentally. Holistic DE&I strategies that are kind of integrated across culture, leadership, strategy. If we're talking about games, things that actually talk about the people, the recruitment, the like leading people into kind of more leadership roles, but also the content, and holistically looking at all of these things like they're part of one conversation instead of siloed chunks of, inclusion. Works so much better if you can kind of integrate and embed this information and make it so that it's not for one person to carry on their shoulders or one team to carry on their shoulders, but is actually embedded and it's an educational piece where others are carrying this and realizing its benefits. That works. Centering lived experience is really effective as well. So prioritizing qualitative insights, actually having focus groups, getting employees to tell their stories can show nuanced issues that otherwise wouldn't get picked up, while also improving employee trust and retention. So the benefit of focus groups is not just that someone gets to hear the things employees have to say, it's that employees get to feel heard. So if you run a focus group that is effective and you actually listen to employees, and then you say to them, oh, well, like 90% of the things that you said we can't fix, but we can fix those 10%, and we really appreciate you sharing with us, it has been shown that that can still make a positive difference, because at least the employees get to feel heard. They get to feel like somebody gives a shit about the things that they are, caring about. Resourcing and authority. DE&I teams with a real budget, authority, and operational overlap are significantly more effective at implementing structural change. This is, again, a way in which I was incredibly lucky and got to see this play out in real life when I was at Sledgehammer, because I did get given, budget and authority, and I could actually make meaningful change within that organisation. I've seen plenty of DE&I practitioners, and I'm doing an interview series at the moment with a number of DE&I workers anonymously so that they can tell me what they really think. And there are a lot of very interesting stories about teams that are kind of kept to one side. And there was one person in particular who talked to me about how it sort of felt like they were being kept there so that at a moment's notice they could kind of be excised from the company if they needed to be. If it was no longer relevant, it was very easy to just be like, great, go away, rather than giving them kind of resources, authority, and the ability to really make kind of integrated change with the team. More significant metrics is also effective, actually having KPIs beyond workforce and demographics. So part of this is, how do we track whether people stay, not just whether people join, how long they stay for, why they leave. Are we doing like qualitative work thinking about like exit interviews, and are we doing those exit interviews in a way that means people actually feel like they can speak their mind, or are we just emailing them a survey after they've quit? Are we tracking promotions and seeing what the progression is for people within an organisation? Are we seeing if that's equitable, if there are maybe limits or issues that certain people are facing as they're trying to move up in an organisation? Checking for things like pay gaps, understanding the nuance of what a pay gap is. It's not literally these two people doing the same job and one's getting paid 85%, but like, oh, collectively our women are getting paid a lot less because we keep not promoting them. Things that kind of show a more structural issue. And safety, getting like actual data on whether people feel safe within an organisation, whether the culture of that organisation is making them feel like they can be themselves, is really important. So how do we track those KPIs, those numbers, that qualitative data, that survey information, checking in with how people are feeling beyond just this year we hired 2% more people of colour, because that is cool and all, but do they want to stay there? Do they feel good there? Are they happy? Are they going to leave next year because they've come in and then realised it's actually awful to work for you? So how do we track those things as well? Pay auditing works. Organisations that conduct regular pay equity analysis reports improved trust and retention. So you'll notice that the answer there isn't they've seen that now their pay is more equitable. What they've seen is that if they're transparent and say they're doing this work, people trust the organisation and stay at the organisation for longer. They also stay there because they know that they're getting paid their worth, which is one of the reasons that people will leave. If they get an offer that looks better, they will potentially take that. But if they're present at an organisation where they feel like the pay is equitable, they're being paid what they're worth, then that can encourage them to stick around. And that also reduces legal risk, right? So we're talking about the fact that maybe the goals of certain employees versus certain executives are different. But if we can create programs where it actually achieves everything on everyone's list, like that is a much easier thing to sell up the chain. Leadership accountability is also effective, incorporating DE&I goals into executive incentive schemes. So basically saying, all right, one of your goals that's tied to your bonus this year is getting some of these DE&I outcomes. We just had some metrics, thinking about improving those things. How do you tie that to things that maybe certain leaders will care about more? Some leaders are beautiful and have great morals, but some are way more motivated when it gets tied to their bonuses. And so how do you kind of leverage that, right? So all of these things, it's important to remember that meaningful organisational DE&I change must be an ongoing cycle. And so all of this is stuff you can try and then test and then check to see if it's working, and then maybe it doesn't, so tweaking it and figuring out how it might work better for your organisation. You need to continually revisit the goals, assess to see if the programs are being effective or not, see if the employees are feeling a difference. If they're not, ask them what they think might work. Sometimes the feedback you get will be like, oh, we should try this thing. And you might go, oh, that wouldn't work for these reasons. But I know why you're saying that. So how do we then use that to tweak this program in a way that we can do? There's always new research in this field as well. So checking back and figuring out how to incorporate that research, seeing if new strategies work, if things are being proven, and just continuing to iterate. Feedback-driven cycles, iteration, they're essential for changing the structures of an organization long-term, for that kind of long-term transformation. But like, this isn't news. This is something that organizational change models have argued for literally decades. They have said that one-off interventions are insufficient. They do not make organizational change. And so, of course, one-off DE&I training sessions don't work. They aren't designed to. You can look at things from like the 1930s that will say that this isn't going to work. And this isn't a DE&I specific flaw. It's just a basic truth of organizational change. So we need to aim for more long-term, more integrated methods of making this change. Lots of current DE&I programs achieve exactly what they were designed to do, which is compliance and optics. That's based on a skeleton from the 1960s. Even if the organizations themselves don't think that that's what their programs are trying to do, if they've taken the same models that have been used before and just copy-pasted them and continued to use them, that's what their programs were built for, whether they know it or not. And so the question is is that what they want? And if that's the case, well, that sucks. But if they don't want that, if you have an organization where that's not what you're actually aiming for, then how do we recreate these programs to achieve those new goals instead of these ones? If we want DE&I programs to achieve something else, we need to fundamentally change what these programs look like. And to do that, we need to make executives listen to bottom-up demands for this type of sustainable organizational change. We saw in the 2010s, the 1910s are just time traveled, the 2010s and the 2020s, that bottom-up pressure really, really worked. We saw that made a difference. We saw that companies wanted to do something as a result. Some of them, not for the best reasons. Some of them, it was more about visibility than anything else. But some companies really started to do good work in this space as a result of that. And so bottom-up pressure is everything. We need to keep making that noise. And here's some examples of how we can do that. So if you're the kind of person who's like, this is a great talk and all, but I'm not in a position of power, what am I supposed to do? Here are some things you can do. So when you are talking about DE&I with executives and people in positions of power above you, you can frame inclusion in multiple ways. If you know what the person you're talking to values, you can frame it in a way that you know that they will value. If you don't, you just hit them with all of these things. You hit them with, here's the moral argument. This is why it's a good thing that we should be doing. Here's the creative argument. Here's the ways in which it will actually make our team more creative. This is the way it's going to make us more money. This is the way it's going to make our team work better. It's going to make it better for retention because fewer people will want to leave, and that's great because then you don't need to train more people. You just hit them with every argument you can. Because there are arguments that fit into all these categories. And you might hit somebody who is like, oh, I don't really care about the retention aspect. We can just train new juniors. Okay, cool. But here's my other arguments. Have you noticed these ones? And so that can really help you to kind of make meaningful change and kind of get the ball rolling with some of these initiatives. Build credibility and trust. So try to, as much as you can, back things up with research, back things up with here's something else that someone else is trying, look, it worked for them, what if we try it here? Start with small programs, be like, oh, here's something, I just want to do it with my little team, or I just want to do it with, what if we just do it for a couple of weeks? Let's just try it for the next sprint. And if it works, you can be like, look, here's some data. I can show you now that this worked. Or, what if I just do a little survey with these people and just kind of let you know what they think? Start that so that you can build that credibility to then back you up when you're like, let's make it bigger. Let's try this other thing. Let's try this kind of innovative and experimental thing because see these other things I tried and they worked really well. Use that to back you. Work collectively as much as you can. Find other people who care about what you care about. Use them to kind of split time. A lot of this stuff, especially starting out when you're building credibility and trust, I know is volunteer work. It's where I started doing a lot of this. It was unpaid. If you can work collectively, you can share the load. You can have people to have your back in conversations. You have people who you can call and be like, you won't believe what they just said to me, and it will make you feel better. It's really useful. Like I said, provide research and data. There's heaps out there. I'm trying to kind of push more and more out into the world as well now that I'm kind of back in this research field. I care so much about this field. So if you're ever in a position where you're, I talked to this executive and he said this thing wouldn't work. LinkedIn message me and I'll be like, here's a paper. Let me know, I'll help you out. Because I care, and I think a lot of the stuff we're trying to do is actually backed by data, and a lot of the questions become more related to terminology or more related to bias or assumption. Like if you're talking to an executive who in the 1980s was working and doing a bunch of sensitivity training that was designed to not be effective, they probably have some misconceptions about how ineffective DE&I programs are because they were doing ineffective ones, And so how do we break that down? How do we use data to actually show, oh yeah, no, you're right, that stuff is ineffective. I'm asking for this other thing that works. And start with small, low-cost pilot programs. Whatever you can do that allows you, again, to build that credibility and trust, have something in your back pocket that you can show that it works. So in summary, most current DE&I programs are performative by design. Whether or not people know that that is what they're working with, a lot of DE&I programs don't work because they weren't designed to, and they're building on a skeleton that wasn't designed to. To make effective DE&I programs, we need to revisit our goals. Effective programs will focus on structural reform instead of performative one-offs, more organisational change and less individual labour. Holistic approaches instead of isolated initiatives, things that are embedded, things that are ongoing, things that will keep actually making a difference. And they will centre lived experiences of the actual employees instead of centering compliance needs. They might still contribute to compliance needs, they might still impact that in a way that is helpful, and that can sometimes be part of that list every single argument when you go and talk to someone kind of slide that you put together. But effective programs should centre the experience of the people you're actually trying to help. Cool. And that's me. Thanks. I will take some questions, but I'm also around to answer questions after this. And I also have my linked tree link up there, which has my LinkedIn, and it has other ways you can get in touch with me, places to see my research, all that stuff. But yeah, if anyone has, I think I have 5 minutes or so to answer questions, if anyone has any. Do we need to do mics for that? Do I just listen and repeat them? Does that work?
There is a mic there, or you can just have people yelling.
That's fine. If you're happy to yell, I'm happy to listen to your yelling. Go for it.
Firstly, thank you. That was awesome.
Thank you.
And I hope you don't mind that I took pictures of just about every slide, if that's not okay.
That's completely fine. And if you want me to actually send you the slides, I can do that as well.
There's a bunch of stuff I want to talk about, so I'll ask you after
Awesome.
as well. But this is amazing. And there's a question I wanted to ask around some of your research, which is obviously fairly US-based. And a lot of the kinds of programs that they ran in the 80s, we obviously didn't run in Australia. But if you have a look at particularly women's participation at senior level in Australia, at like CEO level, we actually don't have the same levels of participation as the US does. So is that an argument to say that those programs to a degree worked?
I think it's a lot to do with how we follow the US, but we're a little behind. And so a lot of the time we are, as a country, it's a really weird thing that happens where, especially in games, but it happens in other industries as well, where the US kind of exports their attitudes and we eventually pick up on them. And so the impact that Trump's administration is having in the US has not been anywhere near as significant for us yet. But I think that wave just hasn't kind of reached the coast yet, And so I think that's sort of the same with, the number of CEOs and things, directors that we're seeing in, especially, again, in the tech industry, we have more companies in the US, and so the percentage of women kind of is slightly higher because of that as well. But I think the wave of that improvement just hasn't quite reached our shore yet. And I'll be really interested to see how in the next kind of 5 years or so we see the impact of kind of both of those tsunamis simultaneously, because one I'm looking forward to and one I'm not, and I'm like, I don't know. But yeah, it's really interesting because part of the research I am doing at the moment, like you said, is quite US-centric, but I'm also doing some global research looking at how DE&I kind of isn't relevant in a lot of ways to like Japanese game culture, and how things like the shareholder reports in the US, the UK, some other English-speaking countries, and Australia and New Zealand have had this bell curve of interest in DE&I outcomes, and how Japanese companies have just been literally a flat line. And yeah, that's kind of an interesting, yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk. Again, like Darcy, I have very many questions to talk to you about. I think my question would be around, a lot of what you're talking about is coming from sort of institution or government agency perspective, but I do wonder how these models or approaches could be taken in a more grassroots community organization kind of context, because these are the same problems that we see replicated again in gangs, communities, and they have the, I guess, excuse of saying that, oh, we don't have the budget, or we don't have the talent, we don't have the people that are doing this stuff, and I guess that's a very long question, but is there something that we could take from that you think is also applicable to grassroots organizing?
Yeah, sure. I've got like this really big message that's saying, please use Q&A mic for the recording. So just for future reference, the message says, please use... Anyway, I will answer, I'll repeat your question. So basically, yeah, how do we use these things that we're kind of talking about for a big scale in a smaller scale environment for a grassroots kind of an organization? And I think a lot of it is applicable in no matter the scale that you're in, right? I also think you kind of get a little bit less bureaucracy and a little more freedom sometimes in a grassroots organization, where if the people that care about it, then you can kind of get away with things, trying stuff that you wouldn't otherwise be able to. But the benefit, the key word there, I guess, is if people that care about it, and so it's really hard if they don't. So you get the kind of double-edged sword there. A lot of the same kind of bottom-up pressure arguments apply, where if there's certain people you need to convince of things, you can use that to kind of try and achieve that convincing. The lack of resources is obviously a big issue, but it's a big issue in literally every single aspect of a grassroots organization, right? So yeah, I guess trying to pick like one thing that is really effective and being like, great, like let's try this on a small scale, let's try this with as little lift as we can, let's use that as now our example, like trying not to do every single thing all at once. Thinking about things like mentorship as a really great example, right? Like how do we get someone who can come in and do a talk and maybe mentor some of our people? How do we do like one of these things and try it out and see how it works and build that credibility and trust that then comes on that slide about, how do we do bottom-up pressure? So yeah, I would just consider like thinking small, trying something, and remembering that like, so much of it is about like that sphere of influence, right? You can't do everything. Even when I was in a big organization and I did have resources, and I did have support, I couldn't do everything. So what can you influence? How much can you influence? What can't you influence? And, you can be anxious about it, but you can't actually touch it. So like, just try and focus on this bit as much as you can. And if that means doing baby steps, then that's totally cool, because at least you're moving forward, right? I think that's it in terms of time, but more than happy to chat with any of you this afternoon throughout the conference. I'll be around. But thank you all for joining me. Thank you so much.